How's it going, everybody? Thought I'd do another one of these since the last one I did went relatively well. I wanted to talk about the rise of Ice Earth and Final Fantasy TCG in the current Opus 16 metagame. So, we're going to go in, and first things first, we're going to take a look at the Reraise Omaha results. And you're going to notice one thing. We have 6 Soiree decks, all through here. These are all Soiree. And then at the top, first and second were taken up by Ice Earth. And I believe they were some of the only Ice Earth players at the event. I will pull up the list in just a second, but if you remember from my last video, I made a tier list, and you're going to notice something is missing. Here is that tier list, for instance. Okay, Soiree, tier 1. Cool, makes sense. Sky Pirates, Fire Ice Aggro. These are Moshri decks. Moshri, of course, was banned for Omaha and probably is mostly banned at large events going forward. I suppose she might be legal at Portland, but regardless, okay, it makes sense that those would fall out of meta. I've got my Mono Wind, Samurais, again, all these are interesting. There's no Ice Earth on this anywhere. I mentioned decks that aren't good like Scions and Ninjas, and I did not mention Ice Earth. So we have this new archetype that's kind of come out of nowhere, basically starting at Dallas, where it made it to Top Cut, I believe, as it was the only deck with multiple representatives in Top Cut at Reraise in Dallas. And now both of the best decks at the Omaha Reraise were Ice Earth. So we have this deck that, as far as I'm concerned, sort of kind of comes from out of nowhere. I will say Ice Turbo Discard is relatively close to Ice Earth. They do similar stuff. So I'm not fully off the mark, but it's a different iteration than I thought it would be. So, okay, so why is Ice Earth good? Where did it come from? What does the deck play? So what does the deck do? So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to pull up the deck lists from Reraise in Omaha. I'll pull up the winning list by Sam Prime. But essentially, it is a glacially slow control deck. I'm going to go ahead and drag the FFTCG profile over here. So you'll see it's only running 16 forwards, it's running 18 backups. The sign of most control decks that really aren't looking to be aggressive will play very large backup counts. This was the case for Mill and a lot of other stuff. 8 monsters, including a full 3 Scale Toad, 3 Biblos. This deck is looking 100% to sit back, let the opponent exhaust the resources, and do it. And then 16 forwards, all of these are very strong perpetual value cards. I think the only one that doesn't continually do something is going to be something like Mira. But almost every other one of these cards does something the longer the game goes on. So, if I go back to the slideshow, these are kind of the key cards in the deck that I've picked out, the most important ones. So first off, Scale Toad. Scale Toad says that your opponent will never increase their hand size because they have to discard if they have more than 2 cards in their hand, or 2 or more cards. So your opponent will eventually get down to 1 card in hand, and if your opponent plays a card and then has to discard for Scale Toad every turn when they draw their 2 cards, they're not gaining any cards. It is impossible to go up in hand size while Scale Toad is on the field. You have Arcanist, which kind of came from out of nowhere, this kind of silly card from Opus 5, to become kind of the best control tool in the format. This card is actually, it looks like a meme on paper, but it's legit. This is an incredibly powerful stun effect, and notice that this is a standard unit backup. You can play multiple Arcanist, and for the cost of a Ice discard and dulling Arcanist, you can basically lock your opponent out of attacking for the turn, which is incredibly powerful. Decks in Final Fantasy TCG only can run 50 cards. If your opponent draws at all or searches, you only have probably 10 to 15 turns to kill. Arcanist can say that those 10 to 15 turns are coming up very short. Something I didn't really anticipate seeing. I know that people are going to laugh or Sam Prime and a couple of the others are like, I don't see how people didn't realize this card was this insane. I did not anticipate this Lightning being as strong of a control tool as it is, and it's a very flexible card. Essentially, what this card reads is that if she lives a turn, she is both an aggressive tool and a defensive tool, which is exactly what this deck wants. It doesn't really need to ever be aggressive, but if you're able to both dole a forward to get out of the way and then bounce a different forward, this card kind of deals with 2 forwards every single turn while being a 9k body. And 9k is kind of the sweet spot where this card is hard to remove for its cost. It's very hard to remove this card for less than the 4 CP you used to play it, which ends up being quite good. And the 2 mil is not actually really that big of a downside because your opponent is probably going to end up drawing or searching more than you do over the course of the game with this deck. And then lastly, I'm going to go ahead and move to the next slide because the real win condition of this deck is Physalis. Physalis is kind of the ultimate boss monster for any deck that is attempting to discard. So you have the combination of Scale Toad and Unileska. So what does this do? Scale Toad says your opponent eventually has to get down to 1 card in hand. And Unileska says that 1 card in hand is actually not in their hand anymore. Which means that Physalis now generates 3 CP worth of value every single time she attacks. Minimum. Draw a card, choose a character, dull freeze it. So if you choose a backup, you're locking them out of 1 CP for 2 turns. Actually, it's 4 CP. Which nothing can compete with that. You cannot compete with 4 CP for free every single turn in top deck mode. That is not a thing that exists in the game. So you have the inevitability where if the game goes long enough, where Scale Toad does what it wants to do, and Unileska is in the back line, Physalis is a card that says you win the game, in the same way that I would have said Garland's Flare says you win the game, or Mastery hitting the field with 30 summons in the break zone. It's the same kind of inevitability that causes these decks to be very difficult to deal with and very strong. Okay, so why did I miss this deck? Where did this come from? What has changed? There was an extremely favorable metagame to this deck, and the biggest factor in it, I think, was kind of the rise of Arcanist. I think before now, Arcanist was a card that just kind of got overlooked because, in general, people would play good stuff decks, and good stuff decks would play 2-drop forwards, 3-drop forwards, 4-drop forwards, 5-drop forwards, so on and so forth. The diversity of numbers was there. And it really took the rise of a deck like Soiree and the general power creep of the game to get to the point where most decks now don't necessarily play a mono cost forward lineup, but they're getting there. A lot of very powerful cards cost 2 or cost 3 if you want to lock out something like Avalanche, or in the case of Soiree, which again is considered to be the best deck of the format, the most popular deck for good players, they all cost 4. Well, Arcanist now can say, for the cost of, again, dulling the Arcanist and discarding a card, that you cannot attack that turn, which turns off all attack triggers, turns off the ability to take damage, and it also says that I have time to draw my board wipes and my answers to whatever you're playing. So it allows Ice Earth to play this very glacial control game, which allows for its win condition to get along, the combination of Scale Toad, Unileska, Physalis. The other thing, there's no monster hate in the game right now. So first things first, this is a full list of every card printed in Opus 13 or later that has the effect that breaks a monster. This is it, 4 cards. And I'm not even going to go over the viability of some of these. Stern is literally banned. This Clavet is a 4-drop black belt that requires you to play with lightning and wind to break a monster. This is not a viable card. Noctis, to break it, requires you to party attack. How are you party attacking through Arcanist? You have to have 3 forwards on the field with 3 different costs to get Noctis to attack, or to get the party attack trigger to break the Scale Toad. This is not an answer to Scale Toad. This is not an answer to Scale Toad. This is not an answer to Scale Toad. This is a 4-drop answer to Scale Toad that also requires an additional resource that basically costs 2 CP. This is not a reliable answer to Scale Toad. And, when you go ahead and pull this up, Mira exists. So they're playing a full 3 line of Scale Toad and 2 Miras. So if the Scale Toad dies, they can Mira the Scale Toad back. You cannot remove Scale Toad right now. It is not a thing that the game currently allows you to do. So again, as cards get better, you want to play newer cards because newer cards are generally going to be stronger than older cards. It's how card games work. It's how you have to print better cards in sets, because if better cards don't get printed, people don't stop or don't play them, which means they don't buy them, which means the card game dies because product isn't being sold. You have to print better cards, but there have not been good card answers printed to monsters basically since Opus 12, and even then, only in specific colors. This is the full list of cards with the ice element that have an effect that could break a monster. So we have this horrible, horrible Orphan that will break the Scale Toad in 3 turns. This doesn't answer Scale Toad, I'm sorry. You've already discarded a card by the time this happens. They have so much time to find an answer to this card. And then you have Lock, which is expensive and a combo piece, and also requires you to be playing Wind CP in your deck. This doesn't answer Scale Toad generically in Ice. So there's a whole color of the game that has no answer to Scale Toad. This is the full list of water cards that break a monster. You can bounce it with Leviathan as well, at which point they will say, okay, cool, and they will replay it next turn. This, as an archetype, water has no answer to Scale Toad, and this is a 6 CP card that requires you to sack 2 of your own forwards if you have them. If you don't have them, you don't have the offensive pressure for when they find another way to play the Scale Toad. This is the full list of legal generic cards with an effect to break a monster. You have Sephiroth, which requires you to get your opponent to damage 4, at which point the Scale Toad's probably already ripped your hand to shreds. You have Noctis, which again, how are you ever party attacking? You have Neo X Death, which your opponent can sacrifice any other card they want that is not the Scale Toad. And then you have Arden, which has the same problem as Neo X Death, except this card is horrible. None of these are answers to Scale Toad. The other thing is that the Mashiri and Sophie restrictions slowed the game down. Mashiri no longer lets you just draw 6 cards to draw out of your problem. Sophie no longer gives you a win condition without attacking that also pluses your hand size in a way that Scale Toad doesn't interact with. So you've had this really strong combination of effects where there's no monster hate in the game in the current format. You have to go out of your way to play a bad card to break a monster that you would never play if Scale Toad wasn't a card, and people aren't preparing for. You have Arcanist as a tool that is starting to be able to shut down entire decks by itself. And again, they'll play a slow game because if they're the dual discard and discard 1 card, if your opponent is discarding 2 or 3 cards every turn due to your Scale Toad and your Unalesca and your Orphan, you're coming out ahead over time. And the general slower pace of the game and the ability to slow the game down to a crawl with those tools, and the strength of Earth Control tools, Hecaton Kyre is all of a sudden in a fantastic place again. These cards were so strong that they enabled Mill as an archetype last set, as a deck that literally just says, I will not search my deck and I will break every forward you play before you kill me. And again, if you can survive long enough, you get to the point of inevitability, the deck wins. So, okay, this is a new deck, it's clearly top tier. What's the counterplay? How do you do it? If you are playing a deck, you must have Monster Hate in your deck. That is how it is. You either have to have Monster Hate, or you have to go fast enough where the Scale Toad can't reduce your hand size enough to lose the game. So my option, if you're in Wind, congratulations. You get to play anything you want. There's 2 viable summons. You also have Lulu to recur the summons, which is great. Yasmat breaks it every turn. They would have to find removal for a big old 10k. A little hard to get out, but, you know, you take what you can get. And then also, if you're in a dual element, both this Prish and this Locker are fantastic answers. If you're in Earth, you have 2 generic answers. You have Robel and you have Fenrir. Personally, I like Fenrir a little more, since you can also kind of get a 2-for-1 if you hit their backup line. But, I mean, Robel's also just a decent answer because it'll also... Robel has the ability to flush your hand out of the normal issues, and they must deal with the Robel to get you to 0 cards in hand. So, I think if you're in Earth, you should be playing one of, if not both of these cards right now. Lightning has a couple of decent answers. This Odin will do it. I like Rama, but Rama doesn't hit 3-drop. It only hits 2-drop monsters. I also think this Dragon might actually start needing to be a card that people need to be running at least a copy or two of, which is good because Lightning has very strong monsters in general and a lot of very strong monster synergies. I think the Waff Twins are criminally slept on cards from the new set, and I think this Dragon could easily find us a home in a deck that would very much enjoy access to it. If you're in Fire, you have to be on the Sifrita right now. I'm sorry. You need probably 2 copies of it. Maybe you can get away with less if you're on the 5-drop of Frida. If you can recur it. But if this card gets hit into damage against that deck, you kind of just lose the game on the spot. If you're in Water, I don't like either of your answers. These aren't really good answers to the thing. And then Ice has no answer to this. So if you're in Water or Ice, you probably need to consider a splash of a color. If you're in Water, I'd recommend probably Wind would pair with it. Ice, probably Wind or Earth. Lightning really just isn't in a great spot, and a lot of these cards don't pair well with it. But these are basically the current viable outs to a Scale Toad. For Arcanist counterplay, diversify your forward costs. So I've got Zidane here as a representative of that. In something like Soiree, it's very easy to go a Wind variant. And Zidane is kind of a problem card for the deck, because not only does Zidane diversify your forward costs, so they can't just call 4 on Arcanist, because then you're going to be ripping their deck to shreds. Zidane also kind of does 2 things as well. Zidane allows you to plus your hand size in a way that Scale Toad and Unalaska can't interact with. They can't rip the cards you remove with Zidane. And Zidane also kind of gives you an out to the deck out war. You can continuously bounce the Zidane to your hand and replay it, and you'll win the deck out war eventually, even if Zidane can't attack. The other option, if you can find it, is kind of the nice thing about Ice in the matchup. Ice has the ability to attack the Arcanist directly. If you freeze Arcanist once it uses its Dull effect, it can't use it for another 2 turns, because the deck has no reactivation access. So I have Terra as kind of my representative. The final option, go very, very fast and pray they don't have a board wipe. Something like Fire Ice, that might be your answer if you don't want to run multiple copies of the Sifrita to try to deal with the Scale Toad. You just go fast enough where your opponent doesn't have time to set up. Because again, this deck runs a lot of very, very big cards, and it's very expensive to play. So yeah, that is the Rise of Ice Earth. Hopefully you guys found this video informative. If you guys enjoyed this, let me know. I'll keep kind of doing these, going over different metagame things. Maybe I'll do a slideshow where I go over the cards I'm most excited for from the upcoming set. Maybe I'll talk about what I think of the structure deck cards, if any of them have any kind of viability or interesting applications. So yeah, just let me know, and thanks for hanging out and watching, everybody.